Okay, so good to see you back again. Now, we're going to talk. We spoke about utilitarianism in the form or through the expression of Adam Smith in The Wealth of Nations. But utilitarianism never had a more able spokesperson than John Stuart Mill. And so that's who we're going to talk about today. Mill's Mill's background is kind of interesting. He was a logician, and in his personal life, he was very liberal. The name of his major work was on liberty, and Mill's argument is uh, basically that government is best which governs least, and if we keep to the principle that was enunciated by Adam Smith and just get out of the way of people, well, we will get what no one wants to do, which is the social good. Uh, so how should we think about what he has to say? Well, um, why is it so counterintuitive to think this way, that we'll get a social good just by letting people do what they want to do? How would this actually work out? Now, one of the examples of this that's cited sometimes is the traffic circle that we see in our comings and goings, right? And I think I might have mentioned, if you think about the principle of a traffic circle, there's a certain kind of zen to it, right? Everyone is coming at the traffic circle from different directions, and somehow magically everyone adjusts whatever it is that they're going to do in such a way that the social good is accomplished by each individual pursuing their own individual interest. So if I see somebody coming too fast, I'll brake as I'm hitting the traffic circle and I'll let them go. If I think I can get to the traffic circle and get through it faster than the person coming from the other side, then I'm going to do that. And it's kind of a magical sort of thing that, there's no cops in the traffic circle, there's no lights in the traffic circle. It's just a free for all. Everybody just doing what they want to do. And you kind of get there, much more efficiently uh, and, and speedily than any other, anything you could devise. If you just stop for a second, you think about a traffic circle, or rotary as it's sometimes called, and you think about what would happen if you introduced a police officer, or crossing guard or something, or a light. Well, you would hear people honking the horn. There'd be traffic backups and what have you. So, it's that principle I really want to underscore, that John Stuart Mill is the spokesperson for. That life is better, it's richer, if we just let people do what they want to do. They know what's best for them, right? By the way, I should pause here for a second just to point out the obvious. It's because each individual knows what's best for them that we have an argument for democracy, right? Because in the democracy, we're saying, look, I can't tell you what's in your best interest. Only you know that. And so the way I'm going to acknowledge that is by giving you the franchise, giving you the vote. And you can vote, and whatever you decide, you want to vote for, your interest will prevail. So, and nobody can really take the place of the voter, the individual voter. So that's kind of the foundation of democracy, if you think about it. The often unacknowledged basis is that nobody knows what's in your best interest other than you. So why not give the vote to you, and suffrage and all the rest? So why? What are some of the benefits of letting people do what they want to do? Well, Mill argues that life is, in an open society, a liberal society, is sort of like an educational experience. Each of us will learn certain things that, we'll learn things that work, and we'll learn things that don't work. And so we shouldn't try to repress or suppress human behavior. We should kind of go with the flow, and we'll be all the richer for it. If somebody tries a course of action and it doesn't work out, well, then we all learn from that, right? If we see what they're doing, and is a disaster, then then we find out, we learn from it, we become better, our lives become richer, as a result of living in a social laboratory, an educational laboratory. We're constantly finding out what works and what doesn't work. Now, if I mandated certain behaviors, then I would never learn anything, right? I would just, if we lived in North Korea, I would just go with what the party says, right? And I would never get to learn, what works and what doesn't work in terms of individual choices. So that's a very important part of Mill's principle of liberty, that in a liberal society, we are actually living day by day in a classroom, really, and we're seeing what works and what doesn't. And if we suppress human behavior, if we repress it, well, what happens. It just comes out someplace else. We tamp it down here, and it'll pop up as a repressed thought someplace else. And I think historically, there's a powerful argument to be made that in the early America, you could argue that the puritanical restrictions in Salem, Massachusetts, probably contributed to the mass hysteria of the witch trials, right? So social pathologies arguably feed off of this kind of restrictive, this kind of, what we have a word for, puritanical oversight of human behavior. And Mill will have none of it. He thinks that, this is just ridiculous. People know what's in their best interest. And so, the famous line, sunshine is the best disinfectant, prevails here. Mill would argue, don't repress things. They'll just, show up later on as a social pathology. Let them out in the open. If they're unhealthy, we'll find out, because people will make bad choices, and we'll see what happens. And if they advance an argument that's completely bogus, well, the principle of sunshine being the best disinfectant will ensure that better arguments will come forward, and we'll say, okay, well, this is a better argument, we should go with that. So there's a very strong element here of social utility, and I hope you can see a little bit of the connection between John Stuart Mill and Adam Smith on this, that they're kind of fellow travelers in arguing that less restriction leads to a greater social good. One clearly in the field of economics, and the other in wider society. That if we let people do what they want to do, we'll get a better society. Really. Let's try a couple of examples out and see how that would work. Let's think about education, for example. Would Mills's argument for a liberal approach to education be superior to, say, a more directed kind of education? Well, there have been some very interesting experiments in modern educational endeavors. Certain schools where young people, grammar school into high school, are told upon arrival, well, look, we're not going to oversee you, just sort of do whatever you want to do during the day. You have absolute liberty. We're not going to tell you what to study. We're not going to stand over you and browbeat you until you learn the multiplication tables. But we're here to answer any questions that you might have. So kind of a Millsian approach to education. And how might that work? Well, I think, there's a lot to recommend it. Let's think about it for a second. I could envision a situation where a student might be just really intrigued to find out, what was outside their school. Maybe they would have their natural curiosity. They would ask the teachers questions just simply because they wanted to learn, about the tree. How did it get here and what have you. And that would be an opportunity for a teacher to discuss perhaps, the botany of the tree, or perhaps, explain soil and oxygen. And, you get the point. We don't have to, necessarily, browbeat people in order to get them to do what we want them to do. We can create the conditions where their natural curiosity, their natural interest will come into play. And, it turns out that these kinds of experimental schools pair up very, very well with traditional education, the kind with lots and lots of structure. So I think that, in education, I think, we can see the advantages of this sort of thing. I was kind of amazed, this kind of enforced experiment that we've been living under for the past, 6 months. A lot of the children in the neighborhood where I live, didn't go to school. I guess they were studying remotely, in March and April and May. And, it was kind of interesting to me. I don't know what they were doing in their houses, looking at, what kind of educational curriculum they were working out. But I did notice that they really did have this natural curiosity. They were, much more social with their friends. First of all, they were sleeping normal hours. Most children's lives are so overly managed. They have to get up at 7 o'clock, probably even before that, to meet the bus and all the rest. So they were getting lots of rest, which they need. And they were kind of learning all sorts of things, not necessarily the school curriculum, but they were learning things about the world around them that just really came from their natural sense of curiosity, their natural intellect, their desire to learn things. And it was kind of interesting to see that. I did catch some of the conversations they were having with their parents, and they would be asking their parents questions about why this is such, why that is such. So it was kind of an interesting experiment in Millsian education. Very kind of free form and without a lot of structure. And you can contrast that with the traditional kind of education that goes on in America, right? The drill. I don't have to tell you. This is your desk. You will be sitting at this desk for the next 8 hours, right? And you'll get breaks, perhaps. You'll go to another room that will have another desk, and here's your locker. And you will leave at 2:45 or 3 o'clock. There'll be a bell that goes off, just like in the joint. It's heavy duty structure, right? And it strikes some as more training than education. And what is the training for? Well, we're training you to sit at an office desk for 8 to 12 to 14 hours a day, pumping out reports and all manner of other kinds of stuff. So there's a lot to unpack if you think about education in America from a Millsian point of view, from a utilitarian point of view. If I tell you to do something, are you going to do it as well as you would if you chose it? I'm going to say no. Invariably, if you give people the choice, and they get to have some say in what they're doing, it's very empowering, and people are really interested and will excel at what they're interested in. It's just just as John Stuart Mill describes it. So there's an element here of detachment that's actually very very profound, and it touches actually on kind of an idea that's associated with Eastern philosophy, but it certainly has Western equivalents as well. And it's the idea of detachment or releasement or something. You find it a lot in some of the Eastern writers on Zen. For example, there's a professor who for many years taught at Columbia, taught Chinese philosophy and Buddhism. His name was D.T. Suzuki, and wrote beautiful books and very interesting. And he would quote these teachers of Zen, and with often wonderful use of paradox. And what comes across in a lot of his writings is this idea of detachment and releasement, which is so counterintuitive to us so often. Now, D.T. Suzuki was interesting because he was a thinker who was also interested in building bridges. And as I said, there were some connections. In the years before Aristotle, scholars tell us the ancient world was much more porous, and there was a lot more interaction between East and West. And so you do find some of these ideas that we associate with the East, in the West. And one of the thinkers that D.T. Suzuki was particularly interested in was the 20th century German philosopher Martin Heidegger. And in his late works, Heidegger had stressed this idea of releasement towards being. We'll get into that later in the semester, but basically, an openness to the world. And Suzuki kind of, tied that in with these ancient teachers of Zen and their idea of detachment. Now, there are some clear differences between the two, but this is a very old idea for humanity. That's my point. This idea of releasement, that you kind of get what you want precisely by not using pressure to get it. You think about great, tremendous athletes, right? Think of a great golfer. You would think that, okay, the ball is here, the club's here, I'm going to hit this ball into the stratosphere, right? But no, it's not like that, right? You have to actually be fluid in your movements. You have to actually be, kind of soft. Actually, it's counterintuitive, right? And so there is that principle in John Stuart Mill's concept of liberty, that true utility is recognizing other people and letting them kind of be, There's a wonderful episode in the book Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance, written by a person, an individual who's fascinating in his own right. I think his name is Michael Persig. And it details, kind of an intellectual journey for him, psychological journey. And, he's trying to help his friend who's traveling along with him to see that in order to get the most out of his motorcycle, which is kind of a metaphor, he needs to kind of detach from, the inner workings of it a little bit and kind of let it sort of speak to him, These days, for many of you dealing with computers and printers, that's so, becomes so, can I say easy, software updates just automatically happen. If you want to print a file, it's wireless. But in the earlier days of word processing and printing, oh my God, what an adventure, And I can recall more than one occasion where I was, really kind of battling with the printer. And these were these old kind of impact printers. The whole house would shake when it was printing papers, and these little daisy wheels. And just so frustrated. And every once in a while I would remember Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. I would take a deep breath, detach from the printer, kind of come up to it again. It's tempting. It's tempting when you have a child to want to tell them what to do, to kind of manage their life for them. I get it. Mill would argue that no. Look, if you're constantly telling your child what to do, how to do it, where to be, well, they're not going to hear their own voice, right? And they're going to get nervous anytime they have to make a decision on their own. So, I think you could argue that not just in education, but in child rearing. Rearing is such a weird word. Parenting, it's not much better. You're better off using this kind of liberal approach because, a child will hear their own voice and they won't be as as freaked out when they have to make a decision. One of the things that's always intrigued me is that in some of the European countries, most especially France, where they, having a glass of wine is like a sacrament, right? They introduce wine at the dinner table to children very early in life. It's not like something that's taboo in any way, and I believe it's true in Italy as well. You compare that to the States where we have all these restrictions. And I'm not advocating alcoholism or anything, but I think Mill would argue that you're kind of setting the stage for excess by making things taboo by the control. If you introduce children to alcohol earlier in life, then it's not going to have the same appeal, when they're older. It's just going to be a natural or normal part of life. Think about, well, we don't do this, well, I don't know what the status of dorm life is these days, but, hopefully people are not partying or anything, but, I think I've seen a lot of occasions where really heavily parented students, when they arrive on campus as freshmen, just go off the walls, not at UConn, those other schools, and because they've been so restricted in their upbringing that when they finally get a taste of freedom, they go, they go wild, really, or have wild. Whereas students whose parents were maybe more chill, maybe more relaxed in their approach, more liberal, their attitudes towards, college life, party life might be more sensible, more down to earth. So, I mean, as I said, with all of these philosophies, these are different points of the compass, and it's going to be up to you to decide, obviously, whether or not something resonates as true with you or not. But I do think that, there is a lot of truth in the following. In the Bible, the thing that gets inside, well, Eve was framed, right? But the thing that gets inside Adam and Eve's head is the idea of the restriction, right? Because God says, look, this whole Garden of Eden is all yours, and you can have anything you want. But this tree over here, stay away from the tree, right? It's bad. The tree is bad. The fruit's bad. Don't even go. Well, of course. Well, what's over with the tree? That is kind of how a lot of people's minds work. And if you ever tell a child, hey, listen, you can play on the whole rest of the lawn, but stay off this. Well, of course, they're going to make a beeline right for that. As Cardi B says, why is forbidden fruit is always the most attractive, right? So there is that kind of element that the more we restrict things, paradoxically, the more attention we draw to them, the more interesting we make them to people, simply by virtue of the restrictive nature of them. And John Stuart Mill, argues that this is the case in our society, that if we can just sort of avoid the inclination to try to get more control, we'll get the social good. And if we maximize freedom for everybody, consistent with what he called the harm principle, that we will get the social good. The principle of utility will take over. Why? Because if everybody is choosing what's best for them, consistent with the harm principle, then we're going to have a society in which everybody is, moving up. Now, I mentioned the harm principle. That's a really important part of his account. And the harm principle, is simply that, maximum freedom consistent with not harming anyone else, as it sometimes put. Uh, you know, your freedom ends where my nose begins. Right? Your freedom ends where my nose begins. And so there's a lot to recommend that as well. Think about this ethical situation. Should you ask your partner, friend, lover, whatever, for their cell phone codes, so they could check their text messages, check their voicemails, check their call history? What do you think? If you go into a relationship, should you ask for all those codes? Is that a good thing? Yes, please.
Oh, sorry, you can go first. I don't think you should ask for the passwords because trust is like a really big thing in a relationship. That you shouldn't have to be having to ask for the passwords. That just means that you don't have trust, and if you don't trust your partner, why are you even with that person?
Okay, yeah. Ben, were you going to say something?
Yeah, I was kind of going to say something similar along that trust factor. Like, if you're just getting together with someone and you just ask for their codes, like, within that first couple of weeks, like, you haven't built that dynamic, you haven't built that trust. So for you to just come out and ask for the codes, like, I would expect the girl to just be like, well, why are you asking me for that? Like, you don't trust me? Like, it should, like, if you were to get the codes to each other's phones, it should come naturally. Like, it shouldn't just come from one person asking the other. Like, you should be able to build that trust, and it should just come as time goes on.
Okay. Yeah. Other takes on this?
I feel like that would just show like very clear signs of like someone that's like toxic in like a relationship, and it would show like possession, and it could lead to like kind of like, what's the name? I can't think of the word, but like it could lead to someone being like abusive.
Abusive, yeah.
It could lead to an abusive relationship.
Okay, thank you, Brittany. Other takes on this?
I'm just going to say that I agree with what everyone is saying. I 100% agree that if you ask for your partner's passcode really early on, it may build like, I don't know, like the other person might question whether or not you really trust them, and it might lead to a toxic relationship.
Right.
But at the same time, I also feel like a way to build the trust, like if, let's say someone asks for the passcode, the other person, like, I don't know how to explain it actually,
But I get you, yeah.
shouldn't be opposed to giving it.
Right,
I mean,
yeah.
like, because then it might, let the other person think like, oh, like, what are you hiding?
Right.
Or it's just something that people do where it's like, I don't know.
Yeah, no, it's I understand, and it's interesting to see that you're all on kind of the same page of enhancing trust. Can you think of a way in which that might not work?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. Can you argue the opposite? Can you think of a situation where it might be beneficial for people to have each other's codes?
I don't know, maybe if one of the people in the relationship has proven that they aren't the most trustworthy in the past, I think denying the code after a situation like that would, lead to the opposite.
Yeah. It does. It is an interesting kind of ethical dilemma. As I said, these are new kind of ethical dilemmas that I'm sure you guys face, you people face, I should say, all the time. And that's new. That's not something that's been around, before. And Bill would say, let's play this out a little bit. Do we get a better good as a result of living life this way? Do you think? You could be played, right, if you're trusting. But could that mean that you're better? In other words, Mill is arguing that you will be choosing the greater good right? Let's say that that's the greater good in our utilitarian approach to this. And that as a result of this set of choices, there'll be a better, a better outcome. Would you agree with that? Will you be a better person if you trust people, even if you are played from time to time?
Wait, are you asking if we're a better person for
Yeah, let's suppose.
after?
Sure.
Yeah.
Let's suppose we all got together and we decided that trusting is the great, will bring about the greater good. So we trust people, right? We're giving them the benefit of the doubt because that's the liberal principle. Not just for, because we're, good people ourselves, but we just think this is the better way to go. Will it also make us better people, do you think? Because Mill is arguing that if you follow the principle of utility, that will bring you closer to the good life because you yourself will become better. So let's play it out a little bit more. Suppose you're a trusting person. That's your principle. You're not going to be that person who micromanages their relationships. You're going to trust people. That's who you are. And let's suppose you get burnt a couple of times. You get played. Are you still better off being a trusting person?
I mean, I think overall, everyone learns from their mistakes. So, if you go into something a certain way and you get played, I don't think you should necessarily change who you are and be not trusting of people. But maybe you could take a different approach as to what qualifies as if you should trust them or not, so you don't get burned again.
Okay. Good. Other? Yes, please.
I also feel like after each relationship, you kind of pick up the red flags, I guess. So you're more knowledgeable about what happens and whether or not you should trust someone based on whatever.
Yeah. It's tough, right? It really is. There are a lot of ethical walls to kind of balance at once when you try to bring it from kind of the abstract realm of philosophy into one's daily life, and then of course into the most intimate parts of our lives, our personal relationships. And I think that we could go through this in other areas of life. Can you think of some other areas where the principle of liberty would be better than control? I should check the chat thing here. Sorry.
Mind repeating the question? I'm not sure I completely understand it.
Sure. Can you think of some other areas where the principle of maximum freedom, consistent with the harm principle, would work in contrast to control?